the Rent-Free History Show. Today, we are here with Robert Rosen. He is the author of the book Nowhere Man, which details the last 5 years of John Lennon's life from 1975 through 1980. How are you doing today, Robert?
Pretty well. How are you doing, Kemdy?
I'm good. I'm good. Um, kind of. I don't know. I finished reading your book uh, this week, and I was just kind of taken aback by it a little bit. At least like the first couple chapters, because I think I would like to consider myself a Beatles fan, but I guess there's really a lot I didn't know. I guess specifically like post like 1970, I always assumed, in the 70s, Paul did Wings and all this other stuff. John had his solo albums and moved to New York and, just lived with Yoko. George, probably the least I know about, to be honest. And then Ringo just kind of did his own thing, made some solo albums also. John, I always saw as this kind of, as he's portrayed in like a lot of media, this like really Zen figure, especially like posts like their touring days where he just has like the long hair and the glasses and stuff like that. And he was really into meditation after they met with, I think it was the Maharishi, or I might be pronouncing that wrong in India. But there was a lot I didn't know about him. Um, and you kind of go into that whole thing. And it's interesting how you do know like the whole story behind that. If you wouldn't mind telling the audience, like basically how you kind of came into like reading or making this book.
That's pretty much the first chapter of the book. That I went to school with this guy, went to college with this guy, Fred Seaman. We knew each other from the college newspaper. I was the editor. He joined the paper when I was the editor. We became good friends. He lived down the block from me after I moved to Manhattan. And his family, his uncle and his aunt, Norman and Helen, had been involved with Lennon and Ono since the early 1960s. Um, Norman had produced Ono's performance art pieces at Carnegie Recital Hall, cut piece and things like that. And when she married John, Norman met John. They became friendly. And when Fred graduated from college, Fred, my friend, graduated from college, Norman was able to arrange for Fred to be hired by John and Yoko as their PA. That was his first job out of college. This happened in February 1979. This was during the time from 1975 until 1980. John was retired from the music business, and he had pretty much gone into seclusion in the Dakota. And January 1975, you know, he had stopped speaking to the press and he started keeping a daily journal, and he would write in it every single day. Some days he'd, just jot down a few words. Sometimes he'd go like, on and on for a few thousand words, pretty much a stream of consciousness, everything that was crossing his mind. And he kept this consistently, pretty consistently, from January 75 until the day he was murdered in December 1980. And in any case, Fred was with them from 79 through 1980. And he always felt it was his family's obligation to write a book about John and Yoko. And every day well, not every day, but he would call me, or we would see each other a few times per week. And he would tell me what was going on in the Dakota with John and Yoko and their son Sean. This was during the time when he had stepped out of the public eye. And I would keep notes about this in my own journal. And then in December 8th, 1980, John was murdered by an insane fan. And and Fred came to me a couple of days after that, he came to my apartment and he said, "This book that we've been talking about for the past 2 years, now is the time to begin writing it." And he told me that when he was in Bermuda with John that summer, the summer of 1980, John was in Bermuda recording the demo tape for what became Double Fantasy, his last album. And Fred told me that John had told him that he had a premonition of his death and that if anything should happen to him, he wanted Fred to write the true story of his life and to use any source material he needed to write that story. And we started working on the book. Part of Fred's job was to take pictures of John and Yoko and Sean, intimate family photos. And we started working with the pictures. And he would like tell me what was going on, and I would take notes, and I would start trying to organize everything in a coherent way. Then Memorial Day weekend, 1981. This was like 5, 6 months after John was killed. Fred came to me with John's diaries, the diaries he'd been keeping pretty much every day from January 1975 until the day he was killed. And, obviously that was the key to the project. And I transcribed the diaries. I transcribed every word of these diaries, thousands and thousands of words that John was, pouring into them virtually every single day. And it struck me that this was a rough draft of the memoir that John wanted to write, but, never had an opportunity to complete. And then all right. At some point, after this, Fred essentially lost his mind from too much drugs, too much alcohol, too much exposure to seemingly unlimited wealth, too much exposure to fame. Um, and we had an angel. Yoko had fired him at at this point, and he had an angel who was financing the project. Money was coming in. He gave me money to take a vacation. He asked if he could stay in my apartment when I was on vacation. He had been living in the Dakota at this point, and when he lost the job, he had to leave the Dakota. He was essentially homeless. He asked if he could stay in my apartment when I was gone. I gave him the keys. I went on vacation. I came back. My apartment had been ransacked. Everything I had been working on the whole time, the diaries, the transcripts of the diaries, and a lot of other material, Fred took it. And when I got back, he called me and basically said, "I'm fired. I'm off the project." And long story short, as they say, I realized after a couple of weeks of being in shock that I was able to recreate large portions of John's diaries from memory. And that's how the book came about.
I know that Fred Seaman, he made a book of his own called The Last Days of John Lennon. And I was wondering your opinions on that book in comparison to yours. And do you think that one's a bit more just kind of like, I'm doing this like because I want to capitalize on this like for money, and I'm just kind of gonna get this out as fast as I possibly can?
His book came out in the early 90s, 1991, 1992. I read it. It is it's an entertaining book. A lot of what he writes is true, but a lot of what he writes, especially about me towards the end, is not true. And he does a very skillful job of weaving together truth and lies. And, even I, who know the story extremely well, have a hard time figuring out where the truth ends and where the lies begin. But, I would say for all Beatle fans, it's still a book worth reading. It would be interesting to read the two books one after the other. And try to figure out for yourself where the truth in Fred's book is. But, like I said, it's an entertaining read with a lot of truth in it. The problem is to separate the truth from the lies.
Here, or I guess read Nowhere Man. Um, I like picking up the cover. I'm assuming they're expecting some sort of Beatles related story, but it's kind of much darker than that. When you really think about it, it's about John kind of like living in seclusion, being frustrated for certain things in his life, really only finding joy in like things like his son or numerology or just his kind of little obsessions, his diary. He smokes a lot of weed. He has, issues with his weight, even though they're not really issues, especially with the weight he was mentioned in the book, and just the whole kind of falling out of love with making music. And I was wondering if there was like a consensus in opinion when the book was released, like from like people that were Beatles fans and then people that just like kind of weren't as big into the Beatles, but still like read the book.
Census among Beatles fans?
Yeah, the consensus basically among Beatles fans and then people that weren't Beatles fans, if there were any that just kind of like read the book because it seemed interesting.
Well, yeah, I think primarily, of course, the book reached a lot of Beatles fans. It was translated into a lot of different languages. It sold extremely well. I mean, the book changed my life. I went from being, an obscure freelance writer to, the author of a book that became an international bestseller. And I got a lot of feedback on it. And the majority of the feedback was very positive. But, still there was, a significant minority that didn't like the book, didn't like me, said that I, had done something horrible by revealing what was in a dead man's diaries. Um, most that I explained in the beginning of the book that everything that was in the book and the reason it took me 18 years to get it published was because the diaries were unpublished, copyrighted material that, that Fred, even though he said John had told him that, it was okay to write the book and to use whatever information, whatever source material he needed, that was fine. Yoko disagreed with it and did, everything she could to try to to try to stop the two books, my book and Fred's book. What I was able to do over an 18-year period was that things that were in the diaries started appearing on the public record in other people's books, newspaper articles, magazine articles, gossip columns, and then the internet started happening, and a lot of stuff turned up on the internet, and I was able to piece Nowhere Man together over 18 years, fragment by fragment, with material that turned up on the public record. But there were certain things that never turned up on the public record, like John's dreams. So the overwhelming majority turned up on the public record. I was able to piece the information in the diaries together. From that, I was able to capture John's voice. What I created was a journey through John's consciousness, that the book essentially takes place inside John's head. But there were certain things that I was never able to confirm from outside the public record, like the dreams. So what I did in those cases, which is especially true with John's dreams, was create like a parallel universe where I captured the tone and the flavor of the dreams without it revealing um, the exact content of the dreams. And there were a lot of people, like, people who worked for Yoko, who tried very hard to discredit the book. And what they focused on was the stuff that I made clear I had made up because I didn't have access to that material. And they basically said, the whole book was based on lies. But, that was like some very negative attacks on the book. I mean, I saw like 1-star reviews on Amazon from, people who said, I don't have to read this book. It's a pack of lies. I know what's in it. The book is like essentially true. It gets at an emotional truth about John that's not available in the other typical biographies. Like I said, it takes you on a journey through John's consciousness. So the overwhelming reaction to the book was extremely positive from Beatles fans, from people who weren't Beatles fans. There were people who told me reading the book made them want to be a better father. There are people who told me that they read the book out loud to a family member who was recovering from cancer, and the stories in the book, just helped him take his mind off what was going on and get through these very difficult cancer treatments. That was kind of the majority of the feedback I got. That was probably, 90, maybe even 95% of it. But, there was the 5% from people who got, really pissed off about what I did and tried very hard to discredit it. And the reason the book has endured for 26 years now, is because most people recognize it as the truth, and they've said that it brings them closer to John than any other biography they've read.
So I wanted to ask a follow up to that. How did it feel exactly like reading the diaries? Did it? I don't, because that whole like kind of phenomenon where in school I had to read like Anne Frank's diary, and it always felt weird to me because it's like I don't think like she intended anyone to ever read stuff like that. So does it kind of give you that weird feeling like? But it also like is it interesting too because you're kind of like pulling back the curtain on someone you've like known of to some degree, and who was like a very popular figure, and seeing them in a different light as kind of more of like a human being with like flaws like the rest of us.
I found the diaries to be a fascinating document. Um, I didn't feel like I was doing something wrong. I felt based on what Seaman told me that I was carrying out John's will. That, Seaman had told me that if something should happen to John, this is what he wanted done. And, we were doing it. I felt like, what we were doing was a sacred task. Uh, Reading the diaries, transcribing them, recreating them after they were stolen. Um, yeah, I felt like I was communing with John's spirit, and yeah, it was. I knew as I was doing it that this was something incredible that was going to change my life, and it did.
So there's a different version of John Lennon than we're used to in this book, and I think that's why that 5% that you mentioned of people that didn't like the book didn't like it because it didn't really show the John Lennon that everyone was used to. Why do you think people prefer to see him in that mythical way?
I just think that the mythical version of John is a secular saint. Uh, is just it's almost like a a a Disneyfied version of John Lennon. It was just like, this, you know, cuddly little Beatle John. And, that's what people, a lot of people have been living with that kind of vision of John for 60 some odd years now, I think. What for? Can't do the arithmetic in my head at the moment. They were just living with this Disneyfied version of Beatle John. And, that's the way they wanted to see him. Yoko and John, especially when Double Fantasy came out, they had this very sophisticated PR operation that, portrayed them as this happy but eccentric family, bringing up the baby, and, John in the kitchen baking bread and, cooking meals for Sean. It's not that that wasn't true, but it was true to like a very small degree. And what the PR thing did, was they took these little tiny nuggets of truth, like the one about John baking bread. And like, maybe he did this once or twice or tried to do it, once or twice. And just, baking bread is not, baking bread well is not an easy thing to do. And, they just like, made this, house husband thing into the main thing. And that, it was like that in brief, ecstatic flashes for John, but it just, wasn't like that. That, the John Lennon who went into seclusion for 5 years was like, still the, insane rock and roller who was like, doing drugs and, thinking about, having sex with May Pang when, he was supposedly a loyal husband to Yoko. And, he would like lie in his room smoking weed and watching TV. Would occasionally pick up his guitar and fool around with it. But the PR people did a really good job of portraying John as the cuddly Beatle, and that's what people wanted to hang on to. And they didn't like seeing him as a human being with all these flaws and these flaws that everybody has. Some people more than others.
So something interesting that I didn't really know, I didn't think I thought they were pretty good friends, but him and Paul McCartney, that whole thing about like the obsession that he has with like, it feels like competitive and trying to be better than him and one-upping him. I mean, it kind of reminds me of like friendships that I've had in the past where we're always trying to like one-up each other and just like say something funny or say something insightful. But his just seems like it's like sports athlete obsession to some degree, and it's kind of interesting. One that like he's like kind of laughs about Paul getting arrested for marijuana possessions in, I think it was Japan. And then also I also can't believe that the that SNL episode in '76 where Lorne Michaels offers to like for them to like come like on the show was like the last time that they had ever, like, the two of them had ever seen each other in person. And
I don't think, no, that wasn't
oh, it wasn't?
the 1976 thing was not the last time they ever saw each other in person. That, yeah, but they would get together rarely, and they would communicate rarely. But the thing was that John thought about Paul all the time, sometimes virtually every day, and he was always seeing his life as either being up or down in relation to Paul. And it drove John absolutely crazy that, when he was in seclusion doing nothing, Paul was out there with wings, putting out, hit after hit and touring and selling out concerts and, all that. And that in 1980, when, as you mentioned, Paul was busted in Japan for bringing in marijuana, that was like the happiest moment of the year for John, and he was absolutely ecstatic in his journal when Paul was busted. It was like I didn't quote it in my book because I didn't quote word for word anything in the diaries in my book, but what he wrote in the diaries the day Paul was busted in Japan was, Yoko did it. Go to jail. Go directly to jail. Did not pass go. Did not collect $200. And he was just he was he was happy about it. And he felt extremely competitive with Paul. Like when Yoko sold a cow for like a record breaking $250,000. John in his journals considered this a great victory over the McCartneys, a great PR victory. And yet when he was getting back into gear to record the demo tape and write the songs for Double Fantasy. It was Paul's music that he was listening to that got him back into gear, that he kept on playing the song Coming Up from McCartney 2, over and over. And he would he'd listen to it, he'd play the song, he'd change the words, he'd respond to it because, every word of Coming Up was essentially directed at John. It was calling for a Beatles reunion that, John and Paul to get back together. And in 1980, a Beatles reunion was the last thing John wanted. He looked at a upon a Beatles reunion as going backwards when, he wanted to move forward. He was 40 years old. He didn't want to get back to what he was doing in his 20s. He wanted to move forward and be a father.
Speaking of the reunion, I wanted to get your opinions. I don't know if you've seen them, the Disney Plus documentaries, the one that came out a couple years ago, and then the one that just got redone and came out this year, the uh, Get Back documentary, and then the Beatles anthology documentary that have recently come out.
I saw the one a couple of years ago. I forget what that was. That called the anthology too, the one that came out a few years ago.
It was like the Get Back ones. It was like all those sessions before the rooftop performance.
Right. Yeah, that's the one I saw. And honestly, I have not been keeping up with, everything that's coming out. But, yeah, I saw the anthology one and it was long. It was just I watched it. I mean, do you have a specific question about it?
Yeah, I guess like there's a common misconception that like, well, first is like the thing that everyone says that like Yoko broke him up and stuff like that, and that like you know completely ignoring that there were other problems in the band. But I think it's interesting how you can kind of see like the inner dynamics between different members of the group. You see Paul and John kind of ignoring George. You see Ringo kind of just being there at times. You see Paul like struggling sometimes because he doesn't always want to be the leader. And I think it's kind of like multifaceted on how like I guess to some degree when you idolize, I'm not saying I idolize, but like when like people that do idolize the Beatles and other musicians like that, they see them as like these like figures that are almost aren't human, meant that they don't have flaws, that they never had issues or problems like throughout the course of their history. And I'm wondering what you think about why we always like to focus on kind of. Sorry, having trouble forming the question right now, but just why we always focus. I guess this kind of ties back onto the whole version of the world that Lennon celebrates question. We when we see like the curtain being pulled and we see the inner workings, do you think that should be more necessary and that like we don't need these polished like kind of perfected versions of these celebrities? Because like I feel like when they're human and we see their human flaws, they they just seem more relatable to us than how they used to seem back in the day.
Yeah, I think it's good when the curtains pulled back and you see how people really are. And yeah, I mean, just a lot of what was coming out of the Dakota in those days was was fiction. I mean, the song "Imagine" is fiction. Um, yeah, imagine no possessions. I mean, you're singing that. Okay, it's a nice fantasy, but I don't think John could imagine no possessions. He was, deeply into, money and being rich and like, acquiring all kinds of possessions that the average person couldn't acquire, houses and, a house in Palm Beach, 7 apartments in the Dakota, another house in uh, Long Island. And it just, they were extremely materialistic people. And when I met Yoko, I guess I was still pretty young, pretty naive, and I went to him with this idea, thinking about, imagine, I hope someday you'll join us. And I did join them. And, uh, they're not into the world living as one. It's just a nice fantasy. This whole idea of imagined peace. I mean, I, I think we see how well that worked out. Imagined peace does not work. It's like, it's a nice fantasy, but it just doesn't work. That if you really want to bring peace to the world, which is probably impossible, what you have to do is the way these, right wing billionaires, went about projecting their political ideas into the world. That you give money to people who agree with you. You establish schools where you teach people how to be the way you want them to be. And like, I'm sure, Yoko's donated money to politicians, but, she hasn't done a lot of the hard work, which might help in some way, bring about peace in the world. She hasn't established a school to, teach potential diplomats, how to go about establishing peace. That would be a practical thing to do. Establish a school and teach people who want to work for the State Department or the government, how to establish peace. She never did anything like that. She just, projected this meaningless fantasy to the world. I mean, I imagine peace every single day. I march for peace. I marched for peace, last week in the No Kings thing. I mean, does it do any good? I don't know. But, and, what you said before, which I brought up earlier too, is that a lot of the fans just want to see John, the Beatles, a lot of rock musicians, the Rolling Stones, the Who, whomever. They want to see them as these saints, as a secular saints. And I just think it's more interesting to see who these people really are and, to understand what they had to overcome to create the kind of work that they did that touched so many people. And like, the difficulty and the pain of creation, the pain of creation that, drives a lot of people to drug addiction. That, it's interesting to pull back the curtain and see what really happened. And
I
that's
think your
what,
book. Sorry.
yeah. And I said, that's what I did with my book, Nowhere Man, and my other books too. That, I tried to, pull back the curtain and just give a visceral taste of the reality of what I was ever, of whatever I was writing about, be it the Beatles or the pornography business or, Brooklyn in the 1960s.
This question for you before we close. I was thinking about how Nowhere Man really works great as like a story, like a linear story to some degree too. It's kind of like it feels to some degree like every chapter is like a series of like virginettes, and like the very end, at least the part in John's diary, is just kind of bittersweet because it's like kind of like this guy, he's kind of not where he used to be, and he feels like he's just going through a rut, and it feels like he's finally getting out of that rut, but then tragically kind of like cut down. And then you go on this kind of going inside like the head of the killer and like his kind of mindset and the reason why he did everything, and I thought that was really interesting too. I wanted to know, was there anything in the book that you, I guess, like looking back on it, you think, eh, you know, I I probably would have done that a bit differently like nowadays, or do you think you think you wouldn't change a thing?
There's very little in the book that I changed. That there's been many editions since the first edition came out in 2000, and I've added like more chapters to it, to try to give like more background and the reaction to the book and that kind of thing. But the main part of the book, the John Lennon biography part, no, there's very little change. I mean, do a lot of I've done a lot of readings, and there's like a word here and there that I change, but that's like mostly technical syntactical things. But no, there's very little I would change. There's been, I mean, there's been so much reaction to the book. I mean, one thing that really seems to never go away are the conspiracy theories, and I touch on that a little bit in one of the chapters in the new edition. But yeah, I mean, people have attacked me viciously because, I don't believe in the conspiracy theories. I believe that the guy who killed Lennon, Chapman, Mark David Chapman, I think, he was a mentally ill person, a severely mentally ill person. But, there's these people these conspiracy theorists who are just married to the idea that, this was like a CIA plot and Chapman was a Manchurian candidate. And, if you like talk to them about it and disagree with what they're saying, they just get, they take it as a personal attack. They will not tolerate anybody disagreeing with the fact that, Chapman was, uh, a creation of the CIA and MK Ultra and mind control and all this, and I just don't believe it. Uh, I mean, that's one thing that's like really come to light. I'd say in the past 10 years, maybe, and there are conspiracy theorists. The first time I saw this was like right after the book was published, and this book came out right before Nowhere Man did, right before the first edition came out, and it said that I worked for the CIA, and the person didn't contact me, didn't make an effort to contact me. Um, that charge that I am a CIA agent. That eventually mutated with a different conspiracy theorist that I was the CIA spy master who ordered the killing. And, that stuff is insane. I do not work for the CIA. I am a writer. That's what I've been my whole career. So there's that, but, the answer to your question is no, there's very little that I would change in the part of the book that's specifically about John Lennon, the biography part. And, the book endures. I mean, I think it's a miracle that, the book endured for 26 years and there's been so many different editions and translations, and that, people like you that they keep wanting to speak to me and get me to talk about the book. And I mean, I've written other books since Nowhere Man. I've written Beaver Street, which is about a history of modern pornography, and I've written a Brooklyn memoir, which is about growing up in Brooklyn in the aftermath of World War II. And those books did okay, but I mean, I just find it very difficult to imagine that anything I write for the rest of my life is, going to overshadow Nowhere Man. That book just, struck a chord, and, it just keeps on going. And I'm happy to talk about it.
Thank you, Robert. I really appreciate you coming on to talk with me about your book and everything that went into it. I appreciate everyone who listened to this episode. I implore you all to check out Nowhere Man, which you can find at Amazon and wherever good books are sold. I also implore you to check out his other two books. I briefly read the synopsis of the Brooklyn one, and it seemed really interesting. And I didn't uh, read about the porn one, but I'll check that one out too if I have the time. Thank you again, Robert. Even though I already said that, for being on. Thank you to everyone who listened, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
And thank you, Kemdi. I'm happy to do it. And, you have a good day too.